Welcome back, Chris, from
Hey, Jason.
vacation.
Yeah. We almost didn't make it back. We got
Oh
stuck
yeah?
in. So I went to Colorado for a week. And on our way back, we're driving to the Denver airport and we get stuck in Vail because they shut down the interstate for, bad snowstorm. And luckily, we pulled over because the cops and everything had blocked the road. Um, so we stopped at this place and we were looking out the window at the interstate and saw, cars driving by. We were like, we better get in the car as quick as we can because it looks like they reopened it, maybe just temporarily. So we got to the airport and then got to the plane. And then all of a sudden, halfway through our flight back, the we hit some pretty bad turbulence, and then we're circling around Kansas City because we couldn't get back into St. Louis because there was bad weather there too, tornadoes and stuff. So it was a rough end of the vacation.
That sounds like my nightmare.
Yeah, it was. Well, clearly we made it all in one piece, but yeah, it was kind of nerve wracking. How are you doing?
I'm good. Things are good. I don't know that there's a lot of new things to talk about in my life.
You didn't have any harrowing life experiences in the last week?
I have, but I don't know if they're like podcast shareable.
Okay.
Yeah.
They're not Ruby related.
No, they're like life related. I guess the biggest news is I got $10 back from my mortgage company. So
Oh, nice. Where are you going to spend it all in one place?
I don't know. I just spilled water on the check before we started. How do checks work? Will they take a wet check online?
Dude, I just scan them in on my phone and deposit them now.
That's what I do. I'm bad with banks. Well, so by the time this one goes on, we'll have had 2 live recorded episodes out in the world from RailsConf. Those were fun.
Awesome.
And also horrible to experience live. Just like we were up in that area like that whole week and it was so quiet, but then I became so aware of every sound when we started recording.
Yeah. How did the editing go?
It took a little bit of work. Somebody told me that Justin's episode turned out all right, and so that made me feel pretty good.
That's good because both of those had quite a few interruptions.
Yeah, it's I just put it on and listened through, and where there were interruptions, I just cut them out and tried to make it not sound like the worst thing in the world. But
cool. Well, that's good. That was an experiment. Turned out cool. All right.
I realized we have some reviews on iTunes.
Oh yeah, I've never looked actually. That's funny.
I don't know what made me look the other day. There's like 6 ratings. Somebody gave us 2 stars, which made me sad.
Ooh, we need more people to give us a review on iTunes then.
So. Yeah, I think the review we have, so like everybody gave stars so far, and they were all good except that one. And then Ernesto gave us a rating.
Cool.
Sweet,
awesome
person.
Well, that is good to hear. Mostly, it looks like all 5 stars except for the 2 star.
It's all right.
It's fine with me. That is how it goes. We got lots to learn.
Yeah, I always 5 years ago that would have paralyzed me because of my anxiety, but now I'm just like, man, I wish I would have known what we could have done better. But
yeah, well, cool. If anybody is listening and you want to give us a rating, please do on iTunes then, because that helps a lot.
Yeah, it helps us know you're listening and you're interested.
Yeah.
So today we are joined by Lee Richmond. Lee, do you mind giving just a quick hello and introduction?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. Super happy to be here. My name is Lee Richmond. I will rate you guys on iTunes right after this. I'm a software engineer at Bloomberg Government, and I am the creator of Graffiti, which is a API alternative to GraphQL, or generally the best way to build APIs using Ruby on Rails.
Very cool.
Awesome. Lee, what's your background in programming, life? Anything you want to share?
Sure. So I actually came from a non-technical background. I was a political science major. I struggled getting a job out of college. I ended up working at Custom Ink, which is a custom t-shirt company. And I was working as a search engine marketer. And search engine marketers have to deal with Excel a lot. This is millions of keywords and phrases and conversion rates and figuring out just kind of what works and what doesn't and how you want to change your algorithms. And so I had this kind of grunt work job because it was right out of college. And I was spending maybe 4 or 5 hours a day just going into various systems and pulling down pieces of data and plugging them into Excel and doing Excel formulas. And it was very robotic and not fun. And so I started learning Excel a little bit and doing macros, and eventually ended up writing VBA to the point that I could open up IE6 and cause it to log into our analytics providers and scrape all the data and bring it into our spreadsheets and do all the formulas kind of automatically so that I wouldn't have to spend 4 or 5 hours a day doing it. And after I did that, I kind of looked around and said, "Oh, wow! Like I'm programming. I enjoy programming." And so I was lucky enough to be working at a company that really supported me as I kind of transitioned from that marketing team to the tech team, and that's how I began with Ruby on Rails as well.
That's awesome. So you have a project, Graffiti, right? That's the name?
Yeah, Graffiti with a PH.
Yeah, it's got a fantastic little website and a wonderful little logo, which are all the things that I look for in an open source project. For those kind of unfamiliar, well, before we get into that, so Graffiti is really, really high level. It's GraphQL and Rails kind of merged together.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I think that you could say that.
And so before we kind of get into Graffiti itself, would you mind, maybe for those unfamiliar with GraphQL or just maybe just heard the term, would you mind just providing kind of a high-level overview of what that is?
Yeah, let me go about this in 2 ways. Let me give you the short one and a long one. The short one is that if you think about a traditional REST API like we would get by default with Rails, where maybe we have our traditional blog, one of the things that GraphQL does is say, okay, when I'm fetching the posts, I only want to get these specific fields for the posts because that's better for mobile clients, so they don't have to download as much data. It also allows you to say, okay, give me the posts and the comments in a single request. And that can also be advantageous for mobile applications so that you're not having to do all these various round trips. And then the third kind of big thing that I think GraphQL does is add a schema and types so that clients can kind of see your API and know what it does. And you can also build intelligent tooling around it like Graphical, which is GraphQL's editor. So all of these things are how we kind of transition from maybe a typical Rails API to GraphQL to solve a lot of those problems. And if anyone wanted to follow up on that, I think there are great posts on GitHub Engineering blog in particular. For me, though, I actually didn't start this kind of journey by looking at GraphQL and understanding it and trying to build an alternative. I think it's actually helpful to go back and just think about a use case. Like, why do people do this in the first place? Why do we need to fetch the posts and the comments in a single request? Like, when does that crop up? And the use case that I had, I was working for Bloomberg proper at the time. Right now I work for Bloomberg Government, but I was actually working for Bloomberg's infrastructure team that was trying to keep track of all of our servers and packages and libraries and know what was out of date and kind of give warnings about various problems in the systems. And so I had to do 3 things. I had to serve as the endpoint for an ETL. There were a bunch of people doing machine learning and grabbing all that data, and then they were sending it to me to actually put it into the database, so sending it to my API. I also had to be a API for anyone else at the company. So, for instance, like the chef team would hit my API to say, like, all right, what packages are on here and what needs to be updated and what's having a problem right now? What warnings should I do? What emails do I have to send to people to know they have to upgrade? And then the third thing was I was serving as the backend for an Ember app. And because Ember at the time was, and still is, but Ember had just kind of raised the JSON API standard as kind of a first-class citizen. And the JSON API standard was created by Yehuda Katz. And I think that this is not obvious to people at first glance, but it's actually kind of the precursor to GraphQL. It solved a lot of those problems that I mentioned before GraphQL solved them. And so my first exposure to this kind of problem space was trying to get JSON API to work for all those various use cases and trying to have that flexible application where I didn't know how people were going to consume it, but I knew that I had this wide variety of clients. And so I was working on this with a Rails app and using active model serializers, and I very quickly ran into a bunch of problems. And a lot of those problems were with the libraries, but it was also just kind of like conceptually understanding things and making things kind of fit. It's really hard to build an API that's so flexible and robust, but you're not going to enter into some sort of code problem. So that's kind of the origin of Graffiti. And it was only after that, and after that kind of project launched, that later on I went to Bloomberg Government and started to think about this in GraphQL terms and how our applications are really all about a graph of data and how do we best serve that graph of data.
That's interesting. You can definitely see like the move from like kind of the ad hoc JSON responses into, once mobile and things became more of a common thing to integrate with, you end up like, sending duplicate data over a bunch of times. If you have, any kind of model that you might have books with authors, and then you might include the author multiple times, and now you're sending duplicate data. And JSON API kind of, addresses that a bit, but then like GraphQL lets you do a bunch more, like stuff like, making 2 requests at once or whatever, which is pretty awesome. So that's pretty cool. And then, so is Graffiti more than just GraphQL?
So Graffiti is really about not specifically JSON API or GraphQL, but a concept of a resource. And I kind of relate this to a RESTful resource, but you can still power a GraphQL API this way. The premise is if you have this resource class, if we made that a first-class citizen, if that was kind of a first-class part of Rails, then building a GraphQL API or a JSON API actually becomes a lot easier. And that the levels of abstraction that we're given, whether it's a normal Rails controller and you're trying to do JSON API, or it's give up all of your controllers and do GraphQL, I don't think either of these were actually the right abstractions and the right way to go. I think that what we needed was a resource concept that was a abstraction around your API, the same way that Active Record is an abstraction around the database. And it should hold things like, how do you modify an Active Record scope to satisfy a query? How should you save things while still performing validations, things like that. And I think that if you start to think about this concept, not only does it make sense for building a JSON API or for building a GraphQL API, but it also makes sense just for general Rails. I think that one of the things that we place a lot of emphasis on is integration testing. I think that you'll have a lot better of a time using our integration tests than the built-in Rails ones. And even things like trying to get rid of God objects, right? Try to get rid of a huge user model and break that up. Well, if you have this resource class and you say, all right, well, the API logic should live there, I actually think that you can cut down on your models just as kind of a side effect there. You actually have a place to put these things rather than kind of littering that logic across your various models and GraphQL resolvers and service objects and et cetera. I think that it all comes down to having this abstraction around a kind of domain concept, like a post or a comment.
Yeah. Did you ever use what was it called? Active Resource or something?
Yeah.
Way back in the day?
Absolutely. And I'm actually really glad that you mentioned Active Resource because in a lot of ways, we are kind of like a spiritual successor to it. Uh, Active Resource was a client for REST APIs, right? And I actually rewatch from time to time the DHH 2006 talk where he introduced Active Resource, because the entire talk is not just about Active Resource, but about why REST is important to begin with, and why REST forces developers to better envision their domain and ultimately leads to better object-oriented code. But at the end, he gets into Active Resource, and I think that we all know that Active Resource kind of failed, right? At the time in that 2006 talk, you can kind of see in his eyes and the tone of his voice that DHH is very excited to kind of unleash Active Resource onto the world, and he's excited about the power of these kind of RESTful conventions and the things that we can do to build on top of those conventions. But ultimately, the reason that Active Resource didn't work out is because there weren't enough conventions. The Rails backends that the Active Resource client was trying to target were too varied. And so you end up getting all of these different bugs because everyone has different apps that work in slightly different ways. And then you try to fix that bug, but you introduce a new one and things like that. And it was ultimately that we had too much configuration in our APIs and not enough convention. And that's something that actually Yehuda Katz brought up in his 2012 talk, which is called Rails the Next 5 Years. But he's really arguing to bring the conventions that we expect as Rails developers to the API landscape. And if we did that, if we actually had conventions for these things, and we said, all right, here's what your payload should look like. We're not going to allow you to use JBuilder and do whatever you want. This is the structure of the actual JSON. It should be this way. And here's how you sort. And here's how you filter. And here's how you say greater than and less than. And here's how we're going to save multiple objects at the same time so that you can do nested forms. If we actually came up with those conventions, then we actually could build an Active Resource. We actually could build something that is this generic API client that looks like Active Record. And that's what Graffiti has with our client-side library called SprayPaint. Which is a JavaScript implementation of Active Record, where instead of making a database query, we make an HTTP call. And the reason that SprayPaint works and Active Resource didn't is because Graffiti built on top of JSON API and added those conventions so that we actually had a target that we could hit. And once you kind of limit yourself, right, we're Rails developers, we know the freedom that constraints bring. Once you limit yourself in that way and you say, I'm not gonna allow all these arbitrary customizations of the payload, you can actually do much more richer experiences with a lot less code.
So you said something that actually changed my entire line of questions I had. Tell us more about SprayPaint.
Yeah, so the premise here, and I think this relates to Graffiti in general and even GraphQL, is that what we're kind of doing with the web development landscape, and I think that you'll see this with mobile development and single page app development, is we're starting to treat the API layer like a database. I think that you even hear that from time to time, like, oh, GraphQL is kind of like SQL or something like that. I think that we're starting to envision the API as a database because we have to be flexible. If the server is going to build in all this logic, like kind of a traditional Rails API would, or like something with active model serializers would, where you have, big post and thin post and, post with extra attributes or whatever. If we stopped thinking that way and we didn't put this kind of logic on the server and we instead made the server more like a database that just didn't allow SQL injection, then we can have these really flexible clients. We can serve as the backend for a JavaScript client like SprayPaint that works like Active Record, and we can also serve for someone who just wants to curl our API and just get back data really easily. So the way that all this works is you say, okay, well, what do databases do? And when I think about databases, as I told you in my story earlier, I dealt with Excel a lot. And Excel is basically a database, right? tables are spreadsheets, and we do the same kind of operations. The things that I would do in Excel, aside from putting in formulas into cells and crunching numbers, the things that we do with those worksheets are, well, we sort data, we filter that data. And when you filter, you probably want to say, well, sometimes it starts with this, or sometimes it contains this, or sometimes the number is greater than this, right? If you throw me a bone here a little bit, we also paginate data, maybe less relevant to Excel, but that's a common kind of operation. And one of the things that GraphQL taught us was we also specify the fields. That's kind of the equivalent of hiding and showing columns. And then the final thing that also GraphQL does, that kind of fetch me the posts and the comments in a single request. Well, that's kind of like saying, give me multiple Excel worksheets in a single request. And if you relate that to a database, we know how to do those operations with a database, right? If I want to order, I know my order by clause. If we want to filter, I know that I'm going to use a where clause. If I know I'm going to say prefix, then I know how to write that like query, right? And so the premise is, if we can take that finite amount of operations that we need to perform on data, if we can say, all right, the things that we need to do to data are similar to what a Excel person needs to do, then we can kind of limit the scope of what we're trying to target. And that's kind of the APIs that we're trying to build. And that's what Spray Paint can target. So now Spray Paint can look like Active Record and do the same thing that Active Record does, which is the same thing that Excel does, right? You say .where, you say .order, you say, with Kaminari, you say .per, .page, right? These are, or even fields, right? You say .select. Or when you want to get those quote unquote multiple worksheets, when you want to say, fetch me the posts and the comments, you say .includes. All of this stuff, if we have the API conventions for it, then we can build a client that looks exactly like Active Record, because we know what to target. We know how to say, oh, it's the include parameter when I want to fetch the posts and the comments, right? It's the sort parameter when I want to do the ordering. We fall into all these problems where if some developer says that it's called sort, and some developer says that it's called order, and some of us support arrays and some of us don't, that's when you have the active resource problem where you can't target something. You don't know how to build that. You don't know what the backend is going to support. And so with Graffiti building on top of JSON API and targeting those kind of known database operations, that's why we can end up with an actual kind of spiritual successor to active resources, Spray Paint.
That's really interesting. Because the spray paint stuff reminds me a lot of like what people were excited about with Meteor, because you could do effectively your database queries, client side,
right,
transparently, and not have to worry about that on the server side. And it effectively is almost the same thing, right?
Right. And I'll even go a little bit further. One of the things, or I guess when we think about GraphQL, we think about that API, right? I'm going to make a request, I'm going to get a response. And, that's kind of also how we think about JSON API. But if you instead thought about it as this resource class, right? And you said, okay, an instance of that resource class can call to JSON or to JSON API or to XML on it, right? If you can do that, then you could tell that resource to fetch its data independent of any request or response or any API. And then you could push that data over a WebSocket. You could just say, okay, to JSON, and then pass that over the WebSocket, and now it's available to your JavaScript client. And if you want to see an example of that, you can click the Why Graffiti post from our homepage, which has as an example where the data on the page is updating in real time based on the backend, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're using Active Record callbacks, and we say, all right, when we're saving, then call the resource, grab the JSON, and pump that over a WebSocket. And we now have this kind of real-time dashboard where everything is updating. And it took about, I want to say, between both the server and the client, maybe 15 lines of code.
Wow. So you mentioned earlier two things. The first one I want to talk about, you mentioned that there's integration testing with Graffiti. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you made the statement that you might find it easier using what's included than even Rails integration testing. Would you mind kind of explaining that some more?
Yeah. So here's kind of the other way to explain graffiti. Like, you could actually forget about everything that I said prior to this, right? You could forget about APIs and GraphQL and JSON API and all this stuff. And you can instead think about it from the angle of, this is the solution to TDD. I'm not, or at least I have not historically been a test first guy. I have tried my hardest, and I always had pain points. And I agreed with a lot of what DHH said with his, is TDD dead posts and videos, and about how that really affects the design of your code base to do it that way. And it causes actually damage to the design of your code base. I agree with that. That really did kind of reflect my own experience. And one of the things that they left off that kind of series of talks with him and Kent Beck and Mark Fowler, saying that integration tests were actually kind of the answer to this, right? Where you could write an integration test first, but you wouldn't have this kind of design damage anymore, because those integration tests are, by their very nature, decoupled from the design of your code. You're not having to say, okay, I'm going to call this method on this object and I'm going to mock this collaborator. No matter how your code is written, you're going to say, okay, execute this request to the API and ensure that I get this data back. And before that, you'll seed some data to the test. You can write these tests without really knowing your implementation and without getting into the innards of mocking and all those things that make tests hard. And what that means is that you can do TDD and have a great experience, even if you weren't formerly a TDD person. Now, as far as this relates to the built-in specs from Rails, we actually build on top of them. So we are using the active support integration session, and we use RSpec request specs to do our integration tests. But the kind of difference for us is that because, again, we have this known target, we know that we do a finite number of operations and we know how they work, then you actually know how to write every test that you're basically ever going to write. You have to worry about how to see data and how to maybe assert on specific attributes that are going to be specific to your application. But we can take away the hard parts of, okay, how am I actually going to execute the request? What headers do I send? How am I going to say that there's a current user? How am I going to take something as complicated as like the JSON API payload, which can kind of be complicated and difficult to traverse, even though I strongly believe in the benefits of that kind of payload. But it can kind of be a pain to parse. And a developer shouldn't have to be manually parsing that. We should be providing test helpers that just kind of easily assert on the things that we know that you want to and need to assert on. So again, the testing picture is another example of how giving constraints and targeting a limited surface area gives a better experience. Now, the last thing I'm going to say here is traditionally the problem with integration tests is speed, right? It's speed and reliability. Because the integration tests, and depending on who you are, these are acceptance tests or functional tests or things like that. But in an integration test that spins up Capybara and is actually asserting on the DOM, right? That's not what we do. And that's because, again, our APIs are supposed to be flexible. We're supposed to be serving as a backend for a mobile app and a desktop app and third-party clients, right? We can't kind of couple ourselves to any specific view or any specific client. And so our integration test can target the API, which A, is going to be faster to begin with. And then B, we, again, because of these conventions, we have kind of these kind of quote unquote automatic microservices where you can say the post has many comments, remote, and then you pass a string of a URL on where to get the comments. That's all you actually need to do to execute cross API calls, including authentication. And because it's super easy to do that, that means that we lower the overhead and the cost of a microservice approach. And I strongly agree with DHH and others who have argued against microservices. But if we have that limited surface area and we can do it that easily, then you can start to break up your application, or at least have the option of breaking up your application maybe earlier than you otherwise would. And when you're breaking up that application, that means that you can keep a speedy test suite even when you're executing integration tests that are hitting the database and actually rendering JSON and all those other things.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
The other thing that you mentioned that I actually wanted to talk about, Vandal. So this is a UI. But does this actually come out of the box with Graffiti or something?
Yeah, it comes out of the box. Yeah, if you use our, if you go to the quick start, you'll see that we have a Rails application template. So kind of a one-liner to spin up a new Rails app and get up and running. And that will come with Vandal by default.
Cool. So I can't remember the name of it. The GraphQL like interface that comes with it.
It's graphical.
Okay. Easy enough. How do like these two kind of things, are they made to solve the same problem? How do they kind of compare?
Great question. So GraphQL, to take a step back a little bit, it is going to be a little bit maybe a longer answer than you were looking for there, but let's go back to explaining GraphQL kind of generally. As part of solving those problems that I mentioned earlier, as part of that specifying the fields and getting a schema and such like that, what we did was we just totally got rid of the REST and HTTP underpinnings that we kind of have come to expect from Rails. You don't get HTTP caching, you don't get error codes, things like that. And you also don't get REST, right? You don't get this kind of envisioning your application as a domain graph kind of behavior. You go back to RPC, and that's not inherently true. You can try to build in your own conventions and stuff to model something very, very REST-ish. But in my experience, it looks a lot closer to RPC. It looks like these one-off calls. It looks like the promote employee call instead of an employee update call. And because of that, you end up with this API that can kind of do anything. It's the opposite of what I'm saying, right? It's the opposite of the conventions and constraints that I'm talking about. It gives you the freedom to do anything that you want. And I think that the graphical interface is an example of where that's not advantageous. Now, the graphical interface will allow you to kind of specify a JSON request, and we'll give you autocompletes so that you know exactly what you can request, right? So if that post has 20 different fields on it, you have an autocomplete so that you know what those fields are, so that you can see what you want to request. You can see what the possible associations are, things like that, right? And that's why people really like graphical. Like graphical is a slick quality product. Like there should be no doubt about that. Like people love this stuff. But the problem is, there are no kind of conventions around that RESTful resource, right? So what you're doing is you're specifying these fields, and you're specifying maybe the stuff that you want to get back with this kind of autocomplete syntax. But that's kind of all you get. You don't have a way to kind of meaningfully organize these things. You have an easy way to do autocompletes, but you're fundamentally just typing in a bunch of things and getting back some blob of JSON. And so the Vandal approach is a little bit different. It's saying, hey, our APIs are actually not just this bag of fields and types. Our APIs have concepts. We have the concept of resource. A resource has filters. It has sorts. It has defined a way to paginate. And so we can build in my opinion, better UI based on that. So our UI, rather than you're typing JSON and getting back JSON with an autocomplete, our UI is forms. You have a form and drop down. So if you want to say, I want to find all the employees where the age is greater than 30, you can type in the number 30, and then you have a drop down where you can say, okay, greater than equals to, less than is equals to. You have this kind of finite number of operations that you can do on that type. And drop down for sort, right? Here are all the sorts that you support. And then when you get that data back, you're not getting back as a blob of JSON, you're getting it back as a grid. You're getting, a stylized grid of data back, and you can click the rows to see the associations and things like that. And if you did want to see JSON, just because that's how you want to view the payload, you can always click a view as JSON button and see that. But ultimately, the big delta here is that graphical is made for developers, as it kind of should be, right? Made for developers because that's who uses it. And the Vandal UI is really made for anyone, including non-technical users. And this is a big kind of passion of mine. The week before I sat down and created Vandal, I was talking to my product owner who had been working with all these various AWS tools at the time, and he's a non-technical guy, but just to kind of understand what was going on, he was kind of looking at these things, and a lot of it is based on JSON. And he said to me, just don't give me another effing blob of JSON. Like it was just, it did not resonate with him. He didn't want to know about all these like innards of it. If you use graphical, you have to know a bit about GraphQL, right? You have to know about connections and edges and things like that. And the purpose of Vandal is so that my product owner can use it, so that he can just use a dropdown and click a button and see the results. And that will be just as helpful for him as it is for a developer who in the same screen will have a URL that they can copy and paste and put it in their browser and execute that same request and get back to JSON. So the ultimate premise here is domain-driven design. It's a way to elevate these tools past just developers and to the point that other people at our company, especially non-technical people, are able to also use those tools, because having a shared understanding of our domain about what that post means and what the comments are and the various operations that we can do with comments and the various data that we have, that's actually really important for everyone, not just developers. I feel like as developers, we often are vouching for ourselves to say that we should have some kind of input into the product. And I think that the opposite is actually true as well. Product owners or UX people or other non-technical folks in your team should have an idea of what the data is, and they shouldn't have to learn a entire API paradigm and typing JSON and mentally kind of learning to think like a developer in order to do that.
Yeah, I really, 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 really like this, because I mean, when I was like starting to code and do more Rails stuff, I used, SQL Pro or something just to view the database all the time, just because, being able to explore the data visually is so helpful. Yeah. And this gives not just you as a developer the same, ability to do that. You can give this to anybody and they would be able to poke around your database in a useful way. And then, if someone was trying to create like a report or something and they weren't exactly sure what data they wanted, they could go use this and then give you the, URL and be like, here, use this.
Exactly.
And that's incredibly valuable, because that was always one of the things that as I was working with other people consulting, I'd always get things like that. And it was just a pain to go back and forth with people and try and be like, well, what are you actually looking for here? And if they could have just gone and done that for me and then given me, here's what I want, it would be way easier. And that was kind of the same thing I always felt like with working with front-end developers or designers who knew HTML or CSS. I could use, instead of using Haml or Sass or something that they would have to learn, they were already familiar with HTML, and at least SCSS wasn't too far of a, transition for them. Having those tools that can communicate between developers and non-developers on a team is just like, it needs to all be that way. I feel like it just saves so much time in the long run.
Absolutely. And there are a few things also along those lines that we have not added to Vandal, but you can really see how we can kind of take that concept and run with it. One is that we already support, so Graffiti generates a schema for you. It's generated automatically. We just kind of infer from your code what everything is. And as part of that, similar to how you might have an elation file, like a file listing, your devise errors and things like that, you can actually list all the various pieces of documentation for Graffiti. So here's the documentation on that sort parameter, or what it means to sort on that, or here's the documentation of this resource, or the concept of what a post is, things like that. And we can also add that to Vandal so that we're having that kind of shared understanding of not only how to fetch the data like a database, but what that data means and how it relates to the business value of our company. And the other thing that we have not added to Vandal yet, but I'm particularly excited about, is that for a non-technical person, they might not understand APIs and all the various things that's going on under the hood. But what they can do is open up Chrome and go to the Chrome Inspector or Firefox and the Firefox Inspector. And they can say, okay, the page that we've just loaded, it made this request. And what I would like to add to Vandal is that they should be able to copy that URL for that request, paste it into Vandal, and then do the reverse. So rather than typing into the forums and then we generate the data for you and we show you the URL, you go the opposite way. You take a URL and we automatically generate the forums and we give you the data there. And then you can have these non-technical folks and they can say, oh, that's the data that's powering this detail page. Now I understand. That's why it works this way. Things like that, right? So I'm really excited about not only where Vandal is currently, but the direction that we can take Vandal in the future.
That's so great. So, let's see. Chris, did you have anything else? I think you had a couple of questions.
Oh man, that's super cool though. All this Vandal stuff I think is, there's just so much of programming has been kind of, you have to imagine it in your own head, and tools like this make stuff so much easier and
Awesome, yeah.
get stuff done so much better. I was curious if you have any. So how long have you been working on this? Because it seems like quite a bit of work.
Yeah, it is a lot of work. I've been working on it for about 3 years. The project that I described, where it's kind of an API for a number of different clients, I was working on that about 3 years ago. I have since kind of moved departments, so I'm now working for Bloomberg Government. And we've been using Graffiti for all new development for about, I think about like a year and a half or 2 years. It was previously called JSON API Suite. So if you looked at our history, you might not see it as being that old, but it's because it was used to be called JSON API Suite. And the other thing is that until recently, until I think like the end of March, we really did zero advertising of this. And that was purposeful. The only way that you would find this project is if you went like deep into the JSON API issues and found us linked somewhere because I was commenting. And that was so that we could have enough users that we could work with people directly and understand all the various problems and what people really needed out of an API framework like this, without getting so many users that breaking backwards compatibility was a huge problem, and we had that extra weight of having to support those users. So after that 3 years of development, we now hit like the end of March, where we're kind of trying to market this out to the larger world. We hit a 1.0 because we're very confident that these are the scenarios that you need to do incredibly robust, rich experiences at this point.
Cool. Yeah, that's quite a long time, but it makes sense. It's definitely not simple, and a lot of these things it always felt like it kind of addresses the problems I always had with like GraphQL and stuff. I would always look into it and dabble a bit, but then be like, I don't know that it's necessarily solving all of the problems. And a lot of times, like with microservices, it's just changing the problems that you have and not really addressing everything like you imagined it would be. And this does kind of go that distance, which is awesome.
Yeah, and I had the same kind of experience, right? I think that there was a point in the past 3 years, maybe a year into it, where I could have dropped everything and instead targeted GraphQL, like just forget about JSON API and the various Rails underpinnings, but I could have built on top of GraphQL things instead. But ultimately, it was that it wasn't buying me as much as I assumed it would. To hear people talk about GraphQL, it seems to solve every problem in the world. It just makes development like waving a magic wand. but after I actually started using it and exploring some scenarios, I felt like I was taking a step back in a lot of ways. Like certainly it solved a lot of problems, but maybe one or two steps forward and another step back. Because I was dropping support for HTTP caching or error codes or just in general the Rails paradigms that I was used to. And so ultimately I felt like it didn't justify so radically moving away from all of the things that we've kind of built up over the years as a Ruby on Rails community.
That makes sense. Are you guys planning on doing this? Is mostly for Ruby right now, right? And are you planning on supporting like, Node as a backend in the future or anything like that?
It's hard to tell. There aren't any real current plans. If I had a 6-month sabbatical and I could just do nothing else, that sounds fun. Certainly, you could do all of this stuff with Node. I mean, it's all just kind of object-oriented programming and knowing the conventions. But I'm not sure if we'll have that time in the immediate future. And I'm also not totally sure if we should. And that's because different communities have different philosophies. And I think, as I said earlier, as kind of Ruby guys or Rails guys, I think that we are familiar with the benefits of convention over configuration or the freedom of constraints, or maybe we're just more likely to build that abstraction. If I look across the Node community, it's the opposite. It's very low level. It's dislike of those abstractions. I think that the majority of people who are using GraphQL are using it in a very low level way. They're using the equivalent of Sinatra. And so could we build this using Node and TypeScript? Absolutely. Does it conceptually align with that community? I'm not sure. I don't know. I would like to see. That would be fun. But right now I'm very happy with the Ruby on Rails community.
That's such a fascinating point. I've noticed that with just JavaScript as a whole too. Like, we work a lot in Stimulus at my job, and so like I write a lot of just ES6 like classes, and there's a lot of times I'm like, is there an abstraction for this? And it's like, no. Like, or there might be a library that like does it kind of halfway. It is fascinating.
Yeah, and it's not because nobody's thought of it, right? Or that like there aren't enough developers to go around to build that. It's because of kind of a philosophy that the community has embraced. And so if the general premise of graffiti is to limit the surface area and to impose a certain number of constraints in order to reach kind of a greater good, then I'm not sure if we see that in the Node community. And ultimately, I think that if you're a GraphQL developer or any developer in the Node community, I think that you'll feel that pain point. And you mentioned Meteor earlier. I think that kind of echoes a little bit in Meteor itself. I love the concept of Meteor. I wish that some of these things would take off. I wish that the average Node developer that I talked to was using Sales.js or something like that had more defined constructs. But it just doesn't seem like we're at that place right now.
I have a bit of a random question for you. So on the Graffiti website, in the footer, you have Vue.js. Is that your poison?
Yeah, Bloomberg government uses Vue.js.
Okay, how do you like it?
I love it, actually. I think that Vue is the best of the V and MVC frameworks. I prefer it over React. I've had some bad experiences with Angular. And I think the only thing that I would really, in my own head, make a true competitor to Vue at this point is Ember. Just because Ember is not trying to be the V in MVC. Ember is trying to be MVC. Ember is trying to do a lot more. And so I really like how easy Vue is to get started. I love that I can especially just drop in spray paint, right? Because again, if we're thinking MVC, if that's the V, well, I have spray paint. That's the M. So I'm not missing too much if I already have that. I had some initial kind of problems with just kind of learning the basics of Vue's reactivity system. But after that, it's been really pleasant to work with.
That's awesome. We are a podcast divided. Chris is Team Vue. I am Team React.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although I've been using Stimulus more and more on simple things, I really, really enjoy that. But what's cool about this is getting data from the back end will be extremely easy in whatever you're using, really, because you'll just be able to effectively, use a active record like interface on the client side, which is really exciting. I can't wait to try this out.
And that has kind of downstream benefits as well. So do you use Redux?
I have in the past. Or what's the Vuex?
Vuex, yeah.
Yeah.
So any of these kind of Flux style patterns, and for listeners, this is state management, right? You can describe this in a few different ways, but the premise is we're going to stick all of our records into an in-memory JavaScript store. We're going to have various ways to kind of access that store. And one of the things that gets us is that if we have a component that's nested 9 levels deep, the data will automatically sync. I have kind of a bone to pick with these kind of Flux style libraries. I actually think that they are a incorrect abstraction, and I think it's because of that V and MVC mentality. I think that if you're a React or a Vue and you're kind of hands off with a model layer, and obviously your backend, you don't know what backend someone is trying to support. So your data layer is kind of this big gray box, right? I don't know how you're going to fetch your data. And so that means that I need this additional library that says, once you figure out, you fetch your data, now you can use this thing to manage the state of that data. And I think that if you took a step back and you said, what if these frameworks actually emphasize the M? What if they were trying to more cohesively build something? Then I would say, okay, well, if the model is in charge of sending data to and from the server, shouldn't that just be its own in-memory store? Shouldn't we not need a Vuex or a Redux if I had that true model layer? And if you look at Ember with Ember data, that's the case. Ember data will not have that problem with a component nested 9 levels deep trying to sync data, because Ember data is actually the M and MVC, and it does have a identity map that is storing everything in memory, and it's managing that for you. And so with Spray Paint, we also do that. You don't necessarily need a Vuex or a Redux to manage the things that you used to need it for. This is an optional thing. In fact, it's opt-in. You don't have to do the in-memory map if you don't want to. You could keep using Redux and keep using Vuex if you want to. But for anyone who agrees with me in that regard, that you don't want to kind of have to call these various kind of other methods and jump through various hoops to get that gain, then I think that's the other benefit of something like Spray Paint.
That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, every time I use Vuex or something and, was working with forms, I was always like, this is ridiculous. There's nothing, it's clear that they were so focused on, the one, okay, here we have some data, let's render HTML based on that. But there was no, no deeper understanding of how to handle forms and things like that. And it just has kind of been left as a mess. And some people are working on, extra libraries to help, but it's been, it's nasty.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned forms, because this is a huge pet peeve of mine since before client-side development at all, right? Even when you're using default Rails, even no stimulus, if you're going to do a nested form, which is not uncommon, right? I just want to save the post and its tags in a single request, right? It has to be a single request because it has to all be the same transaction. That is actually kind of non-trivial to do. When you want to say, all right, click this button, and now I have a new field to add a new tag. Well, I have to copy the HTML and clone that, and now I have to look into libraries that'll do that kind of copying for me, or build that in myself, or I don't know what Stimulus does in that regard. Or if it's Vue or React, then you're getting a lot of the problems that you just mentioned. And so I'm very happy to say that that problem was really a first-class citizen in the development of graffiti. We have a tutorial and sample app that's an employee directory, and on it is a nested form where you are saving the employee, the positions, and the departments in a single request. And even though it's a single request, that request could contain updating only the employee name, or doing nothing with the employee, but adding a position or deleting the department or something like that. So that's really a first-class citizen, and something that we tried really hard to target as part of graffiti, to just say, hey, your domain is a graph of data. You should be able to just send that graph of data to the server and not need all of these various other hoops to jump through.
Wow, that's awesome. I'm really excited to try this sometime soon. So you guys are using it pretty heavily. Do you have any other like big users that have been using it for some cool stuff?
We do. I'm trying to think of whose name I'm allowed to sell, because I don't want to out anyone. Vox Media has they've blogged about us, so that's public. They use JSON API Suite, not for their homepage or anything, but for internal products. Skylight, Tilda and Yehuda Katz's company, it looks like they are moving their back end to it. I know that they have not finished, but I know that they're working on it now. And within Bloomberg, the team that I was on with that original product, all of the teams around it kind of moved on to different things. It was more of a managerial change than a technical one. But one of our sister teams that still does telemetry work is using it, and then Bloomberg Government proper. There are others. I just am not. I'm not sure if I'm at the liberty to share with them yet.
That's awesome, though. It's really cool to see that Skylight's moving over to it, which is, a big kind of inspiration for stuff.
Yeah, I've actually been, lucky and fortunate enough to connect with Yehuda himself on this. He's really been kind of, shepherding this project and giving us some advice and guidance for the past year. Just kind of in kind of a chat and in some phone calls and things like that, so that we are kind of doing the best to honor a lot of the groundwork that he laid out with JSON API a long time ago.
Cool. I guess that's where we should end it. Where can people find graffiti online?
We're at graffiti.dev, and again, it's graffiti with a PH, like graph.
Cool. Lee, this is all really awesome. I did a little bit of GraphQL at my last job before I left. They started kind of going all in on it right as I was transitioning out. And I haven't really looked at it since, but this project is like so well done that I want to like just dig in and like find a reason to use it.
Awesome. That is really great to hear. I think that you guys are our target audience. I think it's harder to sell maybe a Node developer who's already using GraphQL, but if you are someone who has a history of Ruby on Rails, then we are in your wheelhouse. And I would actually encourage anyone, even if you're not actively working on an API right now, to take a look, because I think it's just a good experience with Rails, even aside from the API aspect.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Any places on the interwebs you want to shout out where people can find you, anything like that?
I'm at RichMoldJ, RichMolJ on Twitter. But otherwise, go to graffiti.dev. And if anyone wants to chat more, there are links to our Slack chat on there as well, and I'm pretty active. And thank you guys for having me so much, and thanks for Casey for introducing us to each other.
Yeah, shout out Casey.
Absolutely.
Cool. Chris, I'm glad you're back and well. Are you behind on work?
Oh yeah. Way behind, but
is your life like a hell of inbox? Yeah,
it's pretty much just digging through, a week's worth of email, which is not the most fun.
That is vacation. It's like you can't relax because everything's piling up.
Oh yeah, it was bad, but oh well, we'll get through it.
All right, well, we'll call it here, and we'll do this again next week.
All right, see ya.
Thanks, guys.